Hello, I'm Roberta Baskin, and I'm here with Dr. Peter Senge, acclaimed author, MIT senior lecturer, Society for Organizational Learning, global thought leader, I would say global guru, really, man with a big heart. And Peter, I just got a quote in a daily quote that was sent to me that is perfect for you. It's by Aristotle: "What is the essence of life? To serve others and to do good." And I think about that in terms of, talking about teaching. And you are a great teacher. So when you look at today's schools and you think about how they are preparing tomorrow's leadership, what gives you hope?
Well, I have a benefit of a very kind of selective opportunities. So, the people I get to hang out with, the schools I get to visit, the places I get to see them, people really doing things, are not really the mainstream. There are extraordinary array of inspiring innovations going on in mainstream public schools today. And I see kids and teachers engaged in very deep learning all the time. And teachers, principals, leaders in school systems really sticking their neck out a lot to do things that is way beyond what you would normally expect to see.
What's a high point example that you've been on the ground and seen?
Well, I have a little 2-minute and 12-second video. It's the one I use more than any other single one, just to kind of make what I just said more concrete. It's 3 6-year-old boys having a conversation around a little system diagram they drew. No one asked them to do it. They're in a school where this is just part of how kids think and learn and make sense of things, to understand why they're having fights on the playground. Mm-hmm. So they're sitting around this table. A teacher actually walked by and said, "Hey, could you explain your diagram to me?" Flipped open her phone and filmed it on the spot, so it's home video. And these 3 little boys are explaining their little diagram of mean words and hurt feelings. And one of the boys says, "Well, first we have more mean words, then we have more hurt feelings, then we have more mean words, then we have more hurt feelings, then a fight breaks out." And these 3 little guys, 6 years old, and they're sitting there going, "Well, we're trying to figure out how to intervene in this system." And one guy says, "Well, we tried saying, 'I'm sorry,' but we don't really think that's very high leverage. So
I'm sorry doesn't work?"
No, he said, "No, we don't think that's very high leverage." And he said, "We tried this, it's crossed out. We tried this, it's crossed out." And they're sitting there having this really quite amazing conversation to understand the system they create on the playground that produces fights. And I've shown that to a lot of folks in a lot of different settings. Probably my most common reaction amongst audiences in the U.S. is, "Can you take that to Washington? God, if we could only get our Congress people to act with the maturity of these 6-year-old boys."
We wouldn't have gridlock anymore. Well, given the state of the planet right now and the human activity that is devouring, 1 1/3 planets a day, and 1 billion people who don't have access to clean water, there's a lot of troubling and sobering statistics out there. Ecological, economic, social imbalance, bigger chasm between rich and poor.
Right.
What do you see as creating a better world in a business sense and in what goes on in our schools?
It is obviously very easy to be disturbed. You could even say kind of paralyzed by just paying attention to what's going on.
Which we can't afford.
No. What's really hard to see, because it really doesn't show up in the kind of macro statistics or the big events that get covered by our media, is there is also an extraordinary array of profound changes that are going on. And if you think about it, probably couldn't be any other way if you have only one basic premise, which is the kind of era we've lived through. You could say the last 200-300 years of the industrial age. I think you could also say the last 500 years of the kind of Western rationalism, which kind of has gradually swept the world in our industrial, consumeristic manifestation. Mm-hmm. If you just kind of take one premise that, well, that's not going to continue.
It can't.
You can't, if India and China reach the level of material affluence and waste of the U.S., we need 3 Earths, not 1 1/3 Earths. That's not going to happen. So if you just start with that premise, that there's going to be a fundamental change, then you kind of would accept the idea that the mainstream is going to keep kind of heading over the cliff, probably faster and faster. There's going to be breakdown, there's going to be chaos, but those are also the conditions for really radical new changes. Again, I get to see a lot of the latter. So I get to spend a lot of time with the social enterprises, the people in the mainstream business world who are really doing radical things. And you realize that the world is awash in exactly the kinds of changes that are needed. You know, that old joke, you know, the future's here already, it's just not spread very evenly.
That's right. I want to share a question that you ask good questions, and in the new book, Flourishing Enterprise, The New Spirit of Business, in the foreword, you asked a great question, and I want to ask you to answer it, okay? How do we tap passion, energy, imagination, perseverance, and willingness to truly grow as a human being in ourselves and collectively?
The better question to respond is, how is that happening now? Rather than it being hypothetical, if you really look at all the extraordinary innovations that are going on, how are they arising? How are people tapping the imagination, perseverance, determination, you know, courage? I think that there's two things that you see again and again. One is a certain, I don't know, any of us could say critical mass, let's just say a certain significant number. It's not 25%, and it's probably not 10%, but it's also not 1/10 of 1%. Of people in institutions are trying to come to this awakening that the future is not going to look like the past. I really think that's not trivial. I think if you get to that as a conviction, I spent a lot of time in South Africa in the mid to late 1980s. Apartheid was still firmly in place. But I tell you, you could feel in South Africa a growing number of people, white and black, who knew that the future was not going to be like the past. That's really, really important. And then secondly, you have to have a sense of what you want to do. You have to have something that really inspires you, that's concrete, that's tangible, whether or not it's something you want to do in your classroom as a teacher, or something you want to do in cities where you have a new business to kind of foster urban renaissance in cities. Whatever it is, there has to be something concrete that allows you to focus your energy. But you also have to have that awakening, because it's not like there's an option.
Who would you point to in terms of companies that are really doing authentic systems change, not just jazzy advertising, not greenwashing, but true, authentic?
Yeah, that's actually a very tricky question. And I'll tell you why it's tricky. No companies deserve to be hoisted up on a pedestal. It's probably the most counterproductive thing you can do for them.
How so?
Well, there's an old saying in traditional Chinese culture, the best people are the hardest on themselves. Complacency is always the enemy of innovation. A sense that we're one of the leaders is one of the worst things that could happen if you want to sustain a spirit of real innovation. So humility, you know, seeing all the things that don't work, those are the things that really characterize the innovators. They're very, very self-critical. So actually hoisting them up on a pedestal and say, well, see, these guys, they're doing it, is actually, if you care about expanding this process, actually the worst thing you could do. Now, that said, people need to see examples. They need to feel that this is not just ideas, that these things are really happening. So you have this dilemma. So the simple way around the dilemma, I think, is nobody's a paragon. Every example you could give, you know, there's 10 times as many flaws as there are things that are going well. Please, neither you nor I as individuals nor any organization needs to be seen in this kind of idealized, stylized, oh, that's what a good person looks like. You know, that will undermine anybody. Years ago, we started to get the idea that the real changes needed would start to come from partnerships, not only between organizations, but across sectors. And so we tried to initiate a variety of big change projects, all of which were cross-sectoral, businesses and NGOs working together. Actually, our vision was businesses, governments, and NGOs working together. But so far, at least in the West, that really hasn't happened, because the governments haven't been able to step up. But I have to say, you know, I think over the last 10 years, I think one of the most significant developments, there really are some beginnings of real partnerships that are having deep mutual influence on the businesses and the civil society organizations. There's not each manipulating the other to accomplish its goal, but really working together to kind of see how the perspective of the other really needs to be internalized in us. The Sustainable Food Lab is now a network of about 70 of the world's largest food companies and NGOs, about a 50-50 mix, and the founding organizations were Unilever and Oxfam. And both of those, in their respective sectors and domains of focus, I think have sustained really quite significant changes. And again, if we don't see them as paragons and realize that if you go inside and you look at what's really going on and you find the people leading this, they'll tell you all the things that aren't working and all the things they're struggling on. If we, long as we temper our perspective in that way, I think they've both done a lot. I used to know Unilever 20, 25 years ago. We used to call them the sleepy Dutch grocers. They were the kind of the paragon of the non-innovative company. You know,
not anymore.
They grew at like 1% per year. No young person in their right mind would want to go to work at Unilever. The last 5-10 years, they're actually one of the most hot companies for young people to go to work at. And they've done this in the food industry, which is not, you know, Silicon Valley. It's a very different context. But if you turn it around, you say, well, what's more basic than food? You know, it's actually the only thing we actually consume, right? And that people actually really care about what they eat. They even care more about what their kids eat. And they really care about the people who produce it. I mean, how many industries have people organize concerts for their producers? The agriculture, the food industry is the only one that people do that because we have this intimate relationship with the people who produce our food. So you start to put those pieces together and you say, wow, this is an industry that really could be a tremendous kind of locus of deep change. Plus, it's the biggest industry in the world.
Peter, you've said words matter, and of course they do. Words create worlds. Just reflect a little bit on the word sustainability, the word sustainable development, and the word flourishing.
Well, I've hoped for a long time, and I think maybe 5 or 10 years it'll start to be manifest that we will outgrow this word sustainable. I think it's been very useful. If I look at the kind of last 15 years or so when this term sustainability and sustainable development have kind of worked their way into the mainstream, to me the single most useful thing they've done is they've kind of dissolved this artificial fragmentation between the environmental issues and the social equity issues. It was never very accurate. I guarantee you, if there's environmental stress, the poor will always suffer most. And so the two are always entangled. And the poor are the least able to be good stewards of their environmental resources. They have no option. They're in a
They're trying to
desperate
survive.
mode of survival. So, and I think that's served the purpose of getting a lot of interest and concern about both, but it also had lasted way too long. And sustainability has created this umbrella. And so the social, the environmental, and obviously the economic all sit under this umbrella. The problem with the word is it doesn't inspire anything. You know,
We've kind of been dulled to the word.
Oh, yeah. Well, we get dulled to any kind of word, but this word was always dull. This word was never sharp. You know, if you think about, well, we want to be sustainable.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? Well, yeah, I guess we want to be sustainable. That's the kind of response people get. I got clued into this years ago. Michael Braungart, one of the founders of the Green Movement in Germany and a longtime partner of the architect Bill McDonough, he's a chemist, Michael's a chemist. He said, you know, if someone asked you how your marriage was and you said sustainable,
Not so great.
it would not be very inspiring.
This is not good.
So it's a word that has served a function, but it's also very limited.
Flourishing.
Flourishing, I think, has much more potential at this point in time. You know, again, we've got to put this in the historical context. You know, words are just tools, right? It's just is it useful and what's it useful for? So I think sustainability has served the function of getting us to see that we really have to wrestle with the whole of the imbalances produced in the industrial age model.
Although when you talk about the whole, many companies have it segmented as just a little small part of the company. It's sort of like the ghetto on sustainability.
Oh yeah, well that's the other thing. And but this is a byproduct of fads. Anything that becomes a fad in the corporate world, you create an office for X. You know, quality was an office. Quality management was an office. Sustainability is an office. And then after a while, if it gets anywhere, that office gets closed down and it becomes part of the work of managers. And, you know, becomes integrated into the organization.
So how do you create a whole system that is flourishing? in a business?
Well,
What are the tools for that?
I mean, if you think about it, historically, businesses that have had a big impact on society, long term, that's what they've done. They've found ways to identify not just short-term but longer-term human needs. They've found ways to connect those real needs and opportunities and aspirations and desires with ways of delivering products and services. That's called innovation, right? They've realized new domains of value creation. Genuine value creation, not just superficial value creation. That's why business has, for forever, as long as we've been thinking about innovation, really been the locus of innovation in modern society. Government is not. That's not really the function of government by and large, but business does do that. So I don't think this is all that new in a way. The problem has become that the way business is managed more and more over the last, I'd say, 20, 30, 40 years, is very short term, very obsessively focused on financial return.
On stockholders.
And pleasing the only stakeholder who really doesn't care at all about your business emotionally, purely intellectual, rational relation called the stockholder. The people who work for your business care. The people whose communities you operate in, they care. The people who you serve, in some sense, they care. The investor, you're just a vehicle for giving a return on capital. You know, so you look at stakeholders, obviously the least kind of important in terms of value generation is actually the stakeholder, and yet I think because of management schools particularly, we've determined that's the one that we should all care about. So with this obsessive focus on return, but when you focus on the shareholder, it becomes short-term return. That's very important. Profit is a very integrative, holistic measure if you look at it over decades. If you look at it over minutes or hours, it's pointless because you can do all kinds of stupid things to make your financial performance look better by simply not investing in this or this or this. If you have to look at it over 20 years, then by golly, it actually integrates all kinds of things. So that's what happened when it became all about pleasing shareholders as opposed to financial return as one aspect of building a healthy business. I mean, all the great thinkers in management have said this. You know, Drucker had the most, I think, evocative metaphor. He said, profit for a company is like oxygen for a person. If you don't have enough of it, you're out of the game. But then he said, if you think your life is about breathing, you've missed something. I mean, it's just a means. The real question is, what are you here for?
Right.
And I think good companies have always lived in that question. What are we really here for? What makes us distinctive? What would we really be excited about? And I'll tell you, making money does never really excite anybody, despite all the press that would lead you to think the contrary.
I want to shift to another word, spirituality, that would make a lot of people shift in their chairs, not you. But why is that such a loaded term? And how do you distinguish spirituality from mindfulness?
Well, it's a very cultural question. Spirituality is a loaded term in the West because it's gotten so interlinked with religion. So the answer to that's very simple. You say the word spirituality, most people in the West think religion. And then they think naturally and appropriately, well, are they about this religion or this religion or this religion? Because we all know the religions have all these differences and often all these conflicts. So that's why spirituality is a word that all of us use very, very cautiously. And I think we should, because we're not advocating any religious orientation or set of beliefs. If you go into other cultures, that's much less an issue. The Asian cultures, spirituality is seen much more as a subject about human development rather than being overly closely associated with any particular religion.
And mindfulness?
Well, mindfulness has the same problem, potentially. I think a lot of people use it now because they think, well, that's kind of neutral. But, you know, I think a lot of people, particularly people who have a strong Christian orientation, see it as very Buddhist because it's been brought forward as a term by a lot of people with a Buddhist orientation. So then you're sucked right back into the same quagmire that, well, you know, I'm not sure I want to do something that's Buddhist, nor would I. Dan Goleman, who I think is pretty tuned as a very sophisticated writer to terms, you look at the label, the title of his most recent book, the title is Focus. the book is all about mindfulness, the way most people use it. Dan's very serious in terms of his own development as a person who has a stable awareness. He's a very serious cultivator, as the Chinese would say. He's very sensitive about fostering religious associations and differences, so he doesn't even use the word mindfulness. But, you know, if you really think about it, the ability to pay attention.
So how would you suggest, as a thought leader, that companies handle flourishing within their organization, for their employees, for their leadership? How would you deal with focus or mindfulness?
Stop doing dumb things and focus on doing good things. You know, there's both. Because typically in these matters, we're doing a lot of things that are moving us in the opposite direction. I was talking with somebody with Daimler Chrysler the other day, the big parent of all the Mercedes-Benz companies. He said, you know, we have a new corporate policy of no emails on weekends.
Wow. Good one.
There are a lot of companies who have been really looking at the incredible counterproductive effect on the ability to pay attention.
The wear and tear on their employees.
It's the stress, it's the anxiety, but it's also the frequency. You know, to be in this perpetual state of interruptedness, continually reacting.
Bombarded.
And you know, we all know it. You go into the meeting, people like to have tables at meetings now, only because they can then hold their device under the table and be doing two things. And the idea that you actually do two things at one time
Doesn't work.
is crazy. You do not do two things at one time. You do one thing at one time. The problem is, while you're doing it, you're thinking about something else. So you live in this perpetual state of distractedness. There have actually been studies. The British Institute of Health did a study several years ago tracking IQ over the course of a day, administering IQ tests like every hour over the course of a day, and found that people in this perpetual state of distractedness, their IQ dropped 10 to 20% over the course of a day. So you stop doing dumb things. You look at ways that you can create a culture where people actually can pay attention to what they're doing. That's, again, why I think the term mindfulness is a little bit tricky, because it's really about the ability to manage your own attention. And then you might also do some things to encourage that. So for years, you know, we've found that really good managers learn how to kind of moderate the typical craziness of a meeting, so there's a little bit of time for pauses. You know, maybe there's 10 minutes at the end to kind of just take a minute, think about the meeting, and then go, what worked, what didn't work? In the Army, they call it an AAR, an after-action review. And they do, they integrate it right into a meeting. So when the meeting's over, they have a little time for reflection. What worked? What was our intentions? What worked? What didn't work? What do we want to do differently next time? That simple little protocol for reflection has really transformed a culture over 20 years. So you look for positive things you can do that are simple, that are easy, that are not woo-woo. We don't have to all close our eyes and meditate here, because many companies that would seem really kind of wacko. But reflection is important. And we all live in a world where there's more things to do than time to do them in, always. So we always have this question of, you know, will we just try to jam a little more into the meeting, or do we take a little out of the meeting and give ourselves a little time to reflect? So stop doing dumb things and find a couple of simple positive things and concentrate on doing those.
Peter, what is your practice? What do you do that keeps you focused?
Well, I first started meditating when I was in college, so it's like a long-term thing for me. And then about 15 years ago, I, by happenstance, acquired a teacher in China, which was very inconvenient, but turned out to be very, very appropriate, partly because I have a long-term interest in traditional Asian cultures and philosophy. I grew up in LA. My best friend was Japanese, so I kind of grew up in an Asian home to some degree. And I've always been deeply interested in different cultures. So having a teacher in China turned out to be very inconvenient and very appropriate. Also got me to start spending a lot of time in China, which I still do. So that's kind of led me to get a little more serious about my meditative practice. And I do a lot of different things. Everybody has to find their own mix of things that work for them, and it's continually evolving. So I have a basic sitting meditation practice every day. When I met him, he said, "I know you meditate." I said, "Yeah." He said, "And you do it when you feel like it?" "Yeah, I do it when I feel like it." He said, "Well, how often do you do it?" He said, "Oh, maybe typically 2-3 days out of the week. And he said, "Oh, now you start doing it. You start doing it every day." And that was really, you know how teachers are. That was really a test
an
question.
admonishment.
Do you want me to be your teacher?
Yes,
And I thought,
exactly.
yeah, okay, I would start doing that every day. And that actually made a big difference. I think starting to become disciplined, to have a practice every single day. Again, I think the practice can vary. A lot of people say, well, my running is my practice. I don't really agree with that. I think for most people, their running is a way to deal with stress. Real cultivation is much more than that. A lot of Westerners don't really still understand this. But then if you start with the simple idea of what does it mean to pay attention. Sure, stress and anxiety distract you, of course. They create physical effects that maybe make it hard for you to pay attention. But really paying attention is a vast space. Anyone who's an artist, a visual artist, a painter, a photographer, knows that you spend your life learning to see. It was all there, and the first time you looked, it was there, but then you see more, and you see more, and you see more. Anyone who's a dancer or works with their body in some way knows you learn to become more and more aware of all the different states of the physical, mental, emotional states being manifest in your body, and as your life goes along, your body changes, so you learn how to make all kinds of adjustments, but it's all based on the ability to pay attention, to be aware. That's vast territory. I would say it's infinite territory. And that's what all meditative or contemplative practices are about. They're not just about being less stressful. In fact, if you get serious about any practice, you will find that often you'll have much more stress because you'll plug in to very deep kind of emotional states that might not be pleasant at all. It's not about being pleasant, it's about being attentive.
Peter Senge, thank you so much for sharing your insights and thoughts, and in a really big way lighting the way for a future path for all of us. This has been great. Thanks.
You're very welcome.